Alexis, thank you so much for taking the time to join me and talk about the imagination dilemmas of your industry.
Thank you so much for having me. There are a lot.
Well, I can't wait to get started on it. Before we do, would you mind giving a brief introduction of yourself?
Sure. My name is Alexis Bonnell. I have the great privilege of serving as the Chief Information Officer as well as the Director of the Digital Capability Directorate at the Air Force Research Lab, where I get to serve the mission both of Air Force and Space Force in looking at the role of new technologies, discovery, and kind of human ingenuity in response to national security.
That's a big task you got there, multiple things going on. So, first of all, how do you see your industry? What is your industry? Because you've touched on many things. So, what do you see yourself in? Which industry, which industries? And then we'll talk about the imagination dilemma.
Yeah, it's so interesting, right? In some cases, government is always an industry of industries event. And so I think if I was going to categorize where I really look to harness imagination, I think it's a few things. So the first is, obviously on the technology side, that's not only being able to imagine new technologies or contribute to that, but also imagining how things that exist or may not yet exist stitch together. And more importantly, what their role is in, our national security paradigm, but also in a really unsexy way, what their role might be in just simply reducing the toil, on our teams, giving them more minutes on mission, helping them find, more time in purpose or mission-driven elements. And so, sometimes, imagination is amazing new products, and sometimes it's just how do we make a process, an experience, a policy, a little bit different, a little bit better. And so that's certainly an area. I would say, a big area that is emerging for me is really the concept of human machine teaming. And a lot of that is really the imagination where I have to look at myself and help other colleagues look and say, in light of this technology, who can I be? What can we do? What is the definition of Alexis or one of my scientists or, one of my military members that I get to serve with? How do they get to have a different augmentation, a different sense of self, and really show up to the mission differently than they did yesterday?
Gosh, this is making me think so much about the need to reimagine identity, but I'm sure you're going to get onto this. So, what is the imagination dilemma that you are facing right now?
I think the imagination dilemma of this moment is very much identity, is a sense of self. And, on a couple levels. I think number one, anytime you're in a large organization, it's very easy to kind of beat the curiosity, out of people and even out of ourselves, whether that's through, toil or other types of elements. And so I think one thing is really trying to be very mindful about how do we in fact make the time, set the expectation of really wanting someone to bring the totality of their genius, right? The totality of their potential. And that's not only kind of giving permission and setting expectation, but it is truly time, right? And bandwidth. I would say the other thing that is maybe an ancillary influencer of that is, what I've noticed in the last 10 years is somehow we started to reward or nurture the voice of the critic more than maybe the doer, the champion. And what I mean by that is, even if you think about how you watch the news, you really don't watch the news, you watch 2 to 6 people's opinion about what happened that day. You don't watch a game, you watch, some ex-athlete's opinion about what happened. And even in social media, a lot of this is it's very easy to have an opinion. And as you and I know, it's very easy to have a negative opinion, and I think that actually really matters when we think about being able to foster imagination and innovation, because what we're asking people to not only take on, the freedom and the belief in themselves, about unlocking that imagination, but we start to add a lot of emotional toil about what they're going to have to navigate and who they're going to have to navigate in order to make any of that real. And so I think my imagination dilemma is, what is the human experience that we're creating? And is that fostering or unleashing, our American ingenuity and our incredible people? Or is it really taking away and eroding the positive incentive structure that really made our nation incredible? And so, for me, one of my favorite things, if you haven't seen it, the World War II sabotage guide. I don't know. It's amazing. But anyway, long story short, it was, a book where we were telling folks how to sabotage the German war machine, right? Whether they were in France, et cetera. And so, as I look at it, so many of the things that are in that have now become standard practice, right? Refer everything to committee, haggle on specific wording, right? All of these elements, bureaucracy. And I think that crushes the spirit. So I think my big imagination dilemma is, how is it that we really create the environment where imagination can thrive? And I would postulate that that's gotten harder, not easier, unfortunately.
Well, please expand on that. How has it gotten harder? Can you qualify that?
Yeah, sure. So I think in a couple ways. I think, in a national security paradigm, one of the first things is that, when we aren't in active conflict, right? When we aren't in war, and we're always happy when we're not. But what tends to happen is, our relationship with risk goes down, and we fill a lot of time with that toil, with that bureaucracy, right? We want to make sure that, well, if we have time, we want to get everything right. And I think we're living in an age now, often kind of referred to as the exponential age, where our maturity horizon is shrunk, right? We're having to make many more decisions faster, and we're having to do that with more information than ever. And so what that means is oftentimes we find that we just keep adding things to people's plates, or not necessarily taking them away. And to have that emotive capacity to imagine, right, to reflect, to think, you actually have to have a moment, to do that. And I'll give you a tangible example. Recently, I'm getting close to turning 50. And, I thought to myself, gosh, I'm really losing my edge. I can't get through all my email. I just can't get a lot of quality time in my work. Maybe this is just what getting older feels like. But I'm a data-driven gal. And so I thought, well, I'm going to go look and try to understand where my time is going. And when I looked at it, I added up the amount of emails I get and receive every year, and kind of average time, the amount of meetings, the amount of required trainings, kind of all of these things that I had to do to officially exist responsibly, right? And it came out to 60 hours a week before I did anything like strategic. And so I think it was a real wake-up call to me on, I have that idea in the shower. I have that idea over here, but it was really kind of giving myself grace and permission to say, if being and capitalizing on my imagination is important, I have to start to find the time and the prioritization of fostering that part of my identity, that part of my leadership. I think it's just become a backseat practice to everything else that is going on.
You are so self-aware, and I'm all about the data. And the thing is, I think so many people do not appreciate that it requires time to imagine, time to kind of put the pieces together. And I love how you've put it together. You're like, I do 60 hours of all this stuff, and there's nothing left. And this is very kind of common around so many leaders. It doesn't matter what industry they're in, where they're just too busy being in response and reactive mode. And that's just the problem, because when you are in that space and you keep continuing in that space and things are changing as fast as they are, you are going to get behind no matter what you do, because you're just still doing the old thing from before. So now that you've identified that, and you've identified that for yourself.
Yeah.
And since you're a leader, you know that you need to figure that out also for your subordinates, because you need their imagination muscles and engines working as well. What have you thought about how you want to go about this as a leader in your organization?
This has been such an awesome journey for our team because, you're right. All of us are struggling with this at every level leader. So I'm going to show you something that we specifically did to be intentional on this. So I think when you have a mission like national security, this is pretty important stuff, right? You really need to, to kind of keep the eye on the ball. And I think one of the things that my team realized together as we were reflecting on where our time was going is that, when you know as a human that your time is not going to the mission, to like what matters most, it erodes your sense of purpose, right? It erodes your actual sense of pride and who you are, right? And how you show up. And that cannot be understated. One of the things I found when I got to work with one of the forces while I was still at Google is that, I asked some folks that were leaving that force what their sense of purpose was before they started. And then what their sense of purpose was now that they were leaving. And it had gone from a 9 or 10 out of 10 to a 2. And everyone assumed they were leaving the force because they could get a better paying job somewhere else. But the reason they were leaving the force was because of toil. And what I realized is that toil kills purpose faster than mission can replace it. So if someone isn't doing what they know matters, their relationship with themselves, the job, everything suffers. So, in reflecting on that with my team, we decided that we really needed to be very clear about our North Star. And so we had these little bracelets made. I don't know if you can see them, but they're just your kind of typical rubber band bracelet. But the first thing that it says is hashtag minutes on mission, meaning our team's job is to make sure that whatever we do digitally, technologically is actually something we can calculate to say, we just gave this scientist more time to discover, right? Or we just gave this person more time to do X. And that, I think, setting the right metric around your North Star. The second thing that's on the bracelet is like tackling the toil. And that's really, about recognizing that the toil takes, right? The toil is nothing but a taker. But the most important one is this acronym, and it's WIDTIW. And what that stands for is, would I do this in war? And if you think about it, that it should be, we can't treat kind of peacetime in the practice field differently than we would, when things really matter. And so I think a lot of what our team is trying to do is to reorient and to be able to exercise that human discretion of, would I do this in war? Does this really matter? And another example that has led us to is we introduced, it's going to sound very dramatic, but we introduced a kill bonus. And what a kill bonus is simply rewarding people for bringing things we can stop doing. Because they're not going to get the imagination time if we don't take something off the plate.
Incentivizing it.
Right. And so typically we incentivize and make heroics of starting things, right? But if we aren't equally conscious that, in fact, sometimes it's more heroic to actually navigate stopping something, then the reality is nothing really gets solved. So we don't have it all figured out, but we're trying to find ways to say, if these are the behaviors we want, if these are the values, what are the types of patterns, approaches, incentive structures that support, those shifting values that we're trying to apply.
I don't think I've heard about this anywhere else where there's a leader who's like, I am focused on getting everybody on their imagination bandwagon here and taking out as much toil. And I love your band, and it keeps that kind of mission and goal in mind. And when everybody's on the same page, then people can call each other out and say, hey, that's toil. We need to get rid of that. And then everybody can together use their collective imagination to say, we all agree this is toil. Our leadership wants that gone. We have been empowered to think about this and get rid of it.
Yep.
Is extremely powerful. So, okay, so this is a great idea. That's like the theory. Now tell me about the practice. How have these bands worked? How much toil have you gotten rid of?
So I would say initially, I think people didn't really believe that I would like write them a check for bringing something we could stop doing. And so, there was a little bit of, does this count? Does this count? And I was like, yes, it all counts, right? So whether that was lowering, the amount of licenses we had on something, whether that was getting rid of space, whether that was, taking a process from 16 steps to 3 steps. Really, I think when you want to make these types of culture changes, you can say everything you want, but until people start to practice, right? And until really you start affirming the behavior, right? So celebrating like, hey, Jamie, helped us achieve this or that. I think the other thing that really matters is being really consistent with the math and the North Star, right? So what I mean by that is when someone, kind of brings up a new idea, et cetera, one of the questions is like, well, how will this reduce the toil, right? How will it give minutes on mission? Is this something that our customers will be delighted by or not? And then I think finally, it really is the math. So in something like IT, it can seem silly, but, we start to look at really critical elements that are very pedantic and practical. But an example might be if I have to enter my name in a system more than once, then that was a waste, right? Or if I, have to do 16 clicks when I could do 2, or quite frankly, maybe no one needs to do this at all anymore. And so, I think that what it really comes down to in an interesting way, which I don't think I understood from the very beginning. But what it really comes down to is actually deep empathy and respect, right? And it's not actually just for your customer or who you're trying to serve. It's actually for yourself, right? I have to respect the potential that I have to make in the world. And I have to think what I have to bring is important enough that I'm going to fight, right, to put my time in the right place and the right, right elements. And I think that is, a bit of grace and self-belief. And I think the way that manifests is actually seeing people who are willing to challenge, right? People who are willing to say, hey, like, is this true to that? People who are going to smack that sabotage guide down on the table, and they all have one, and say, wait a minute, like one of the ways we're talking about doing this is this in a sabotage guide, like maybe we should rethink that. So I think giving people a common language, right? A way to, to collectively share and exercise those values, kind of like cheat codes, if you will, is really helpful.
This is so great because I can already see from the examples you're giving that it sounds like this is diffusing outwards in the organization, this new culture that you're building. So I have a question for, let's say, a leader who's listening to this, who's saying, look, I don't know about you, but there's no way what you have said is going to work in my organization. No way. What is your counter to that? Because, for anybody who's worked in government, we know that it's very bureaucratic, and that would have been a very good counter argument. No way this could happen. Clearly, you're doing it. So whether somebody's in government or in the private sector, what would you tell them?
So I think a couple of things. I think number one, story matters. The one thing that has stayed consistent with me in every place that I've gone, and the interesting thing is you understand the right story to tell when you start from a place of empathy, when you start from a place of respect. And so, whether that's being through the number of different presidential transitions, organizations, et cetera, I think really understanding and being conviction of, am I trying to do the right thing for the right reason, right? Is this an ego thing? Is it, so I think first of all is rooting and being like, no, this is really me trying to make a difference in my organization and the world and the mission. So I think the first thing is once you kind of check yourself and you can confirm that, then that kind of gives you the conviction. And then the question is really, how do I inspire others to have the same conviction? And I think there are a lot of places where we often go wrong. And my realization, I think recently, is that any type of like we talk a lot about digital transformation. Digital transformation is human transformation, right? We're really asking people to adjust, to show up differently. It's not about the tech. So an example I might give you on story is as we're looking to roll out a lot of new artificial intelligence tools, right? Our mission is really critical. We've got to leverage the best technology. One of the ways that people will often talk about tools, and for example, if we think about an acquisition tool or procurement, you could easily say this AI tool is, going to absolutely, modernize this very broken acquisition system. And it's very, everything needs to be fixed. And this technology is the solution. But if you think about it, what we're really saying with that kind of story to acquisition professionals is like, you're not doing good enough. Right? Like we're actually in some ways suggesting that the technology is because of something that they or the process have lacked. And I think that, my counter would be actually our our acquisition professionals are amazing. They're incredible. We don't have national security advantage outside of what they do every day. I mean, they are literally the lifeblood of how we show up, in a time of crisis. And the reality is they're also overworked and overwhelmed and underappreciated. And so instead, if we look at that technology and we say, they are amazing, they are overworked, it is our responsibility to respect their incredible capacity and put every tool at their disposal that will make them, be able to succeed. That's the same technology, but it's a totally different place of starting with respect. And I think most importantly, when you have resistance, when you make it about people, I think most leaders want to show up as good people, right? As good leaders. And so I think that a lot of times when we think about story, we think it's like a frosting thing at the end. And I think actually story drives a lot of what are we doing and why and what purpose. And if you find the right story that is authentic and true, it just becomes easier.
It sounds like you're saying get in touch with your humanity.
Yeah, I mean, we're all peoples, right? Like all of this is people.
We are. True story. So final question for you. What is something that you are working hard to imagine, like an imagination challenge in your head that you are like, this is this next thing I want to tackle. I don't know how to solve it, but it's something I want to imagine.
A really interesting one for me. So one of the things I love and I think is so valuable is when you kind of get thrown in the deep end of the pool. Like I didn't expect to be doing this thing, but I'm doing it now and I'm going to figure it out. In particular, in, the government context, one of the jobs and capacities that I serve is an authorizing official. And that, I really hadn't appreciated how critical this role was in actually unleashing and, and kind of the manifestation of imagination and discovery, right? Because the reality is, especially in the digital space, really nothing gets applied practically until it is authorized. And so what was interesting for me about this is, again, looking individually, what that has meant is in taking on this role is almost the villain in every innovation and imagination story, right? Because you think about it, everyone has all like this incredible idea or concept or way they're going to change. And then it kind of gets subjected to, the gnashing machine of government and compliance. And, as the AO, I'm one of the last people. And so I think what my kind of imagination dilemma is right now is, what would it look like for me to approach this job instead of being the assumed villain and I just got to kind of crack the whip and it's about compliance to, well, what would it look like to be a participating like troop, right? Or get higher on the hero scale. And so that's really making, my team and I'm new to this role. So I don't exactly know, but I think when we imagine things like, well, how might we think about security as a service? How might we think about helping people make different decisions, right, earlier in the imagination and discovery stage, so that it isn't as much a punch in the face, right, at the end. And so, I think for all of us, that opportunity to kind of say at any given time, I hold a place and space in this ecosystem. And instead of being told or adopting what that role has always been to both
Hmm.
myself and others, being able to say, well, could it be different? And if so, what would I have to imagine that looks like? And so I think that right now is, again, I'm newer to this role, so I'm learning from other AOs, but I think also being newer allows me to not necessarily have as much historical identity, kind of
Hmm.
tied up in it. And, I hope that that might mean being able to kind of say, well, could it be different? And some of my ideas are going to be bad and naive and not work, and some might be okay, right, and might make a difference. And at the end of the day, if that means that we get more incredible technology, more manifestations of imagination
Hmm.
into the field and national security, then I can't think of a better output, right, of applying that imagination.
Well, also another thing is that we're living constantly in a new age, and so as you define what this role should be, it definitely should not be anything that's existed before. So I look forward to following your progress on that, and I think our Air Force is so lucky to have you, and thank you for taking the time.
Thanks. Well, wish me luck and congratulations on the book. And I look forward to hearing all the other ways people are imagining so I can learn.
Thank you so much.